Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Folks who listen to this show regularly know that one of my too many obsessions, I can get a little spread thin sometimes with all the things I'm interested in, but one of them is the idea of animism, which is a somewhat problematic term that goes through anthropology and religious history, but basically boils down to the question of how we think about the world as alive, the world being us, being animals, being plants, but also being streams, rocks, clouds, technologies, and the possibility that thinking about liveliness in these different domains with their own different rules, not just liveliness, but even agency, even intelligence, is not only an idea that we can trace back to indigenous cultures, to really all of our pasts in terms of the kind of matrix of a living earth out of which human culture and human consciousness emerged, but also how these ideas can actually help us have insights about what's going on now, which is to say that there's a contemporary kind of animism, let's say a re-animism, that is looking again at how these models are not stuck within some kind of notion of a pre-modern worldview, but in some ways are actually even more contemporary when we try to think about how agency is distributed through an ecological system, or in the case of the conversation we're going to have today with our guest Monica Gagliano, how plants not only can be and should be seen as agents, with their making their own choices, with access to memory, with access to the ability to make choices and to use their senses to build models of the world that they explore, reframe, and modulate. But even further, the more sort of outlandish notion that they can communicate with us, and actually have been communicating with us in some sense all along. And again, we've had a number of people on the show talking about this idea. One person that I always love to reference is, of course, Kat Harrison, who runs Botanical Dimensions. And for those of you who are interested in these things, please check out Botanical Dimensions online. It's a wonderful organization in Sonoma County. I just went up to their library sale about a week ago, and it was a wonderful time. And Kat did a marvelous reading, and she's an undersung hero, in not just in the psychedelic world, but really in the whole world of ethnobotany, and really transforming our relationship to how we think about plants. And it was through Kat that I first heard about Monica, although I had read about her in a New Yorker article many years ago, but I didn't remember the name. And Monica's work is as a plant biologist and really a plant behaviorist is incredibly fascinating, but it doesn't stop there. And she's told her story in really one of the more remarkable crossover books between science and spirituality that I really have ever read, that just came out, called Thus Spoke the Plant: A Remarkable Journey of Groundbreaking Scientific Discoveries and Personal Encounters with Plants, wherein Monica not only talks about some of the breakthrough research that she's done, which we'll talk about in a moment, but goes into very deep and very intimate detail about her more outlandish experiences, from at least from a conventional mainstream point of view, with communicating with plants, plants in the traditional context of a Amazonian dieta, but also just more open-ended and informal rituals, and establishing relationships with a number of different plant spirits that paradoxically, or not so paradoxically, actually inform some of her rigorous scientific studies, which are controversial, but controversial in interesting ways. Not so much about the organization of the studies themselves. I don't think there's actually been too much issue with the experiments themselves, but more about how they can be interpreted and how they can be languaged. So I recommend the book, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So Monica, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Erik, for having me.
Great. Yeah, and I saw you speak at Pioneers as well, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the vibe, and one thing I really appreciated, because and I'll be asking you these questions as well when we talk about you got a gig, or you've had a gig, you are a recognized figure in certain zones within scientific practice. And some of the things you're talking about are really wild, even for people like me who are already very open to these ideas. It's like, you're going to go farther than I feel comfortable going. And I'm very open to this stuff. And I can only imagine, and obviously many of your colleagues are not so open. And you talked about the element of courage at this point in time, required for those of us who are open to these multiple dimensions of reality, but who might otherwise hold down a kind of more conventional role in society. And usually people are kind of more circumspect about this, and you're being quite not circumspect. And I really admire that, and I want to talk about that. But before we get into the kind of more mystical, or in my terms, animistic side of your story, I just want to talk about some of these remarkable studies that you did. And they really blew my mind because, even though I've been interested in indigenous models of an animated world for a very long time, and I know something about biology, not so much. I'm not much of a green thumb. I know more about physics and mathematics and other factors of science. But I thought I was pretty up to it. But it wasn't until I read the book Brilliant Green, like about a year and a half ago, when I was at an ayahuasca retreat in Brazil, that my mind was blown, because what the authors of that book do, where they say, not only can we see that plants communicate, plants perceive, plants make choices, plants have memories, but our refusal to acknowledge that in some sense they are agents, the way that we would describe not just a lion as an agent, but in some sense even single-celled organisms make decisions, move around, like, okay, they're kind of agents too, that it's actually our prejudices that break our ability to recognize this agency. And the book was very good at arguing down a lot of the usual responses that people have, like, well, plants are okay, they're really good, but they're not agents. They can't be da 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 da. So I just want to start with some of the remarkable experiments that you've done that prove some of these or suggest very highly that we should start thinking of plants as more intelligent and more agential than we have in the past. So I don't know, we could talk about different ones, but maybe just the first one that for you felt like whatever your hunches were, you finally got real evidence that something much deeper was going on, and that we really had to start renegotiating our fundamental ideas of what plants are and how to think about them. So maybe you could just start with whichever one did that for you.
Well, I guess, all of the experiments did that for me, because each one of them was a new adventure for me. I'm not a plant biologist, so I'm an animal ecologist. So I actually don't know anything about plants in the terms of what modern biology for plants requires. So I don't know about their physiology, their genetics, their molecular story. And quite frankly, I'm not particularly interested in either, in the sense that that for me is kind of counterproductive at this time, in the sense that we know already plenty and enough, and yet we have missed the organism as a whole, which is more what ecologists do. And in that sense, so being an animal ecologist was an advantage, because my mind was that of a child that, doesn't know anything and goes and learns and plays. But at the same time, of course, I wasn't naive, and I had all the theoretical framework that we have deployed over so many species of animals, and quite successfully, and refined it over so many decades. So then, for me, it was just a matter of pretty much asking the same question using the frameworks that we have and we have well accepted. And so I guess the really first big surprise for me was the very first experiments I did, because, of course, not being a plant biologist, I had no idea. And so I created these... I do describe them in the book as well. I created what I call these matryoshka boxes. And the aim of the experiment, which was looking at chili seed and seedlings, was simply to see whether the communication channels that we already know plants use were all there was to know. And it was, again, to my surprise, that when I started sort of entering this area, I realized that actually there was people already looking into this for plants. And that was incredible. That was great. And most of the work done was in the chemical communication, which of course now is quite well established and lots of people is working on it. And it's typical of science. It's like the first icebreaker is the hard, and then everyone else follows. And then it becomes like the normal status quo thing. So yes, of chemical communication, both underground and on the aerial part of the plants, incredible stuff. And I was like, wow. And then, of course, I mean, light and plants have a long history. And so there was a lot of work already done as well on how plants use different frequencies of light and different ratio of frequency of light to determine basically what's happening around them, whether it's like, oh, here is a fence, and if I'm a climber, I can use it. Or, oh, here is someone growing next to me, and actually they're growing a bit too fast. And if I don't change my growth trajectory, I might get, covered over and I'll die because I don't get access to light. So those were, like, again, quite well accepted and so the common ground. And there was a third one that I found that it was, again, in that realm, and it was how plants communicate through contact. And so if roots touch each other underground, or now we also know the canopy of trees, they seem to have a very good mechanism to kind of work themselves out in space so that they don't impinge on each other. Or if they choose to do so, there are particular reasons why they would do that. So it wasn't just random. So those were basically the three main channels which were well accepted and known as plants communicate this way. And of course, because, as I said, I'm an animal ecologist, and coming from that perspective, it's like, wow, but there is so much more. We know from animals that there is so much more. And one of the things that comes to mind straight away is, of course, sound, because the acoustics is everywhere, no matter where you are. And we have studied it in animals across all areas, all species, all environments. And so I thought, oh, wow. But of course, that was just an idea. And so my first experiment was actually designed to test whether the three channels that we knew of, the chemical, the contact, and the light, were actually really the end of the story or not. So the question was, are there other ways in which plants would know that there is, for example, someone growing next to them? And so I didn't actually pose, I'm going to test whether this is the channel that the plant is using, but more like, is there another channel that the plant is using? And of course, the answer is yes. And at that time, of course, scientifically speaking, I didn't have any proof to show what it was. But the proof was clear that something is happening and the plant definitely is doing something here. At that time, I was already starting to work with, other plants such as the ayahuasca. And from that perspective, which of course I kept very separate from my scientific personality and character and environment. But from that perspective, it was like, but of course they do. And so it started really nagging at me as an idea. How would science try to test this? It might be just all in our minds, and that's okay. I'm happy with that. It's a nice idea and I'm happy with that. But it was like, okay, for me, the role of science is to explore, not research, but explore. And so can we explore this question and see where we end up? And so that's how I then started, getting a bit more focused onto, okay, there is a channel that many channels maybe the plants are using, which we do not know about. Could acoustic would be one of those? And then, we proceeded again into exploring and developing that area in particular. But more since then, I actually bumped into other channels, which, again, bumped is the right word because I was not testing for that. I wasn't expecting that. But I do know that from my experiment, I can see the plants detect magnetic fields, and they're very sensitive to them too. and they will make their choices based on what's available at different levels. So different fields coexisting, obviously, different channels providing different bits of information, obviously. And the plants are just literally, as we do and as animals do, picking and choosing whatever suits them best at that particular context, in that particular time. So that was, for me, the start. And it was one of those kind of situations where your personal experience tells you one thing, and you go in the lab or in, at the university, and you're like, how on earth am I going to do this? How do you ask the question in the most appropriate way so that it doesn't bias the answer that I think I'm looking for? So that I'm not looking for an answer. I'm just asking a question. And then the answer is whatever answer wants to be. And so, so that was interesting because I kind of did it almost like as a wild test for myself. And when I saw, oh, no, they can do it, it was like, okay, so are you ready to embark into this a bit deeper now? And that's where we end up. Look at what happened.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And I was trying to get a sense by reading about your work online and poking around about how just the experiments have been received, in the sense that there's been a lot of controversy about the language around them and how to interpret what these decisions and what these perceptual channels indicate. So there'll be people who don't like the idea of intelligence, who think that's anthropomorphism, and that's a discussion that's interesting to have. But leaving that one aside, is there much controversy about the core sort of on empirical evidence that they use these channels, that they have forms of memory that we hadn't really, the remarkable experiment that shows their Pavlovian capacity to essentially remember different conditions and change their responses based on these, and then in a way make decisions about responses. There's not a lot of controversy about that stuff, is there?
No, and what people doesn't really appreciate, like even within the academia, I guess, is that as an animal ecologist moving to a different field, these fields are often traditionally left very separate and alone. And academia is quite divided into these little pockets of knowledge. So we do not cross. If you cross, why? It will be the first question, like, why would you want to do that? And so that already kind of raises suspicion. It's like you're not qualified to speak about this thing or to speak to this. And so the only thing that we have as scientists, at least for me, is our data. I don't need to speak to anything. My data can speak to anything, actually. And so what happened with my science is that I actually, when I started doing the plant experiment, I was very aware that being a plant person, I'm not qualified. So I actually used even more controls and increased the sample size even further than I would normally know how to evaluate. And it would be, actually the experiments are a little bit overdone in the sense that they are even more than what it would be necessary normally. And yet, as you correctly pointed out, the problem was never the data as such. It was always like what the data are insinuating. What are they pointing at? And which reminds me a little bit of, I think it's a Buddhist say, don't look at the finger pointing. You're looking at the finger pointing at the moon, but we're actually after the moon, not the finger. So yeah, and that first experiments with the chilies and the communication channels is a good example. All the others are, but this one is a good example because, of course, I wasn't expecting that kind of reception. So that paper, for example, when it went out, the editor that handled it sent it out for review, which is the normal process, and 2 or 3 people usually read it. There are other academics, specialists in the area, and they give feedback, and you adjust accordingly, and then the paper usually is moving on, unless there is some real flaw or some real issue. So the editor sent it out. I received my reviewers. I addressed the reviewers, and it was quite straightforward. So I thought, oh, cool, no problems. And then instead, usually what would happen next is the editor would say, like, congratulations, the paper, you addressed the question that the reviewers had and the paper is in. And instead we received new reviewers. And I was like, what? These are new people. And so the editor sent it to new people to review it. Of course, everyone's got new questions, new ideas. And so we thought that then was the end of it. It went through 7 different reviewers. And the editor just, and I understand, is like the editor didn't have the courage. And it goes to what you started talking about at the beginning. It didn't have the courage to take the responsibility of, as the editor, it is my responsibility to evaluate whether this is good science or not. If the reviewers have no problem and they are, I need to trust that they are colleagues. I chose them because I believe they are good people. They know how to do their science. And so I had to take the responsibility that, this paper needs to be published. And he was afraid. He was afraid because not of the data, because of course the data were clear. There is something going on here and we don't know what it is. And that was the problem. It's like, we don't know what it is. And science tend to publish things that this is what it is. And I didn't have that answer. And I didn't care not having that answer. I just, I was excited that there was something that we didn't know. And so it was opening a door to explore again. But I thought that that was quite insightful. And at the time, I didn't realize that would be something that would happen over and over again with my work. And it would escalate as well, to the point that people would not send it out for review in the first place. So the work didn't have a chance to be actually evaluated by my colleagues. And whenever it did, and that was the case with Mimosa that Michael Pollan reported on, like, that paper took me so long to actually get to someone to see it. The reviewers would not even be asked to review. The editors would make that call. So like, we don't publish these things. And it's like, what things?
Yeah. No. Well, it took me a while. I've been interested in issues of kind of parascience and how science manages its borders and what we mean by science. And I've been thinking about that stuff, not totally technically, but, for a long time. But it still took me a long time to realize the way that data, there's a tendency to reject concrete data if the data implies something that's maybe not explicitly stated in the article, but it implies something that goes against the axiom that runs the scientific model, which is a funny way to do science if you really think about it. So it's not like you go, okay, I'm just take a wild example. Let's say you had data that showed some kind of characteristic of Leos, who had astrological sign of Leo, and then you had a robust, large sample that showed that they were unusually represented as actors or something like that. I don't know, some example like that, where the move that most scientists faced with that would be is they wouldn't even bother looking at the data. They would just assume that it's an artifact of some kind of bad data, bad statistics, because we know that there's no way that time or the planets or whatever it is can influence, because there's no mechanism to explain that influence. So therefore, we can just ignore everything. And it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't that people were really contesting data. I mean, sometimes they are, but there's a lot of stuff that's just de facto kind of pushed away. And, you got to really experience that in, kind of firsthand. But are you done with that? Are you kind of like, I mean, you alluded a little bit in your talk at Bioneers, you're closing up the office, moving to Sydney. Wasn't clear whether you're maintaining or even trying to maintain a kind of conventional university research position. And so if that's the case, I'd love to hear like how you decided to go into that other direction rather than continuing to fight what must be sometimes an extremely frustrating and socially awkward, at the very least, kind of fight.
Well, okay, so here is the story. the story is that I didn't choose anything. When I had a big grant from the federal government at the university where I was in Perth, and which was gonna, the main scope of the grant was the bioacoustics of plants, and it was already incredible for some colleagues. It was already like, what did she do to get this grant? As if I had to go pay people, and I just applied like we do with everything else, But so got the grant, and when the fellowship ran out, that grant covered both my salary, my research, everything. So basically, and that's how they work. The university is the host. So the grant from the government goes through the university system. The university administered the grant, but the money is your funding. So when the funding ran out, that's when I closed the door of my office and I disappeared, because there was nothing for me left. And no, I'm not, I should clarify this. I'm not the victim of the system. When I closed that door, because there was nothing for me left there to do, that last 6 months and also that last year, my entire environment, at work, was becoming so alien and so claustrophobic, really. There was no real exchange with anyone. There was no collegial conversation, and I was starving. So I guess that closing down actually was probably the most beneficial thing that could ever happen to my career, because it forced me to this environment is not serving you anymore and you need to move on. And of course, and now it sounds very graceful as I say it. It sounds like, oh, I managed so well. I didn't. Of course, I had a moment of oh no. And now I lost my job, and I tried to, to be positive, and I applied for a few positions. But again, because as I said, the knowledge is so compartmentalized that you, if you cross boundaries, you don't belong anywhere. So when I was applying for this job, literally, I think people didn't know what to do with my CV. It's like, well, what is she? Is she an animal ecologist? Is she a plant person? If she's a plant person, what is this stuff? So I failed miserably with the search of a new job. And basically, I was unemployed for 3 years. And this only changed last week when I moved to Sydney, because the University of Sydney actually is employing me now. I do have an independent grant that is being, administered by the university. And it's hilarious, really, from when you see the story in hindsight, it's hilarious, because now I'm actually at an even better university than I was at. Sydney is much more central. There is a lot of people here. Over the last 3 years, they've been bringing me back and forth to give lectures and to participate to different workshops. And the environment here, the collegial environment that I was so desperately lacking in the other place, here is like, when I arrived, people was like, oh, finally you're here. Oh, it's going to be so good. And we're going to do all of these things. And not only from the other disciplines, which might be easier, for the humanity to say that, but even from my colleagues, my new colleagues, they are here as other biological scientists. They're like, oh, it's going to be so much fun. Oh, and we could do a project together on this. And so suddenly there is that spark of life, which is essential. But I also understand that initial process of compression, really, it was required, because in the story of this, I think that without that moment of, are you going to be serious about this? Are you going to be able, are you going to commit yourself and do it no matter what? And the answer was yes, including losing everything, including losing my career, which of course meant losing my identity, as the scientist, and also questioning everything. So what are you? Who are you?
Yeah.
And of course that gift, I wouldn't exchange it for anything, because it forced me to find me. And in the process of writing the book, I also had to find me through that new character of the scientist that is not afraid.
Right.
The scientist that is going to just speak what it needs to be said without having to play too much the little game that we play. You know, the protecting an identity that it's just a character that I wear, and I'm just a person. You know.
Well, when you say all that, and you talk about the courage, and you talk about being aware of the identity that's bound up with your previous position and how you had to, you know, when you say those things, I also hear someone who's experienced with ayahuasca or experienced with deep medicine work, because whatever else you want to say about it and however you want to put it into a multidimensional cosmos or just talk about it psychologically, that doesn't matter. But on one level, you have to start to break down. You have to have courage. You have to be willing to risk, in a way, your sanity. You certainly have to be willing to risk letting go of an identity position. So I'm really hearing a very interesting way, one of the ways in which your work with plants in that context has allowed your career to move. But of course, there's even more kind of remarkable ones that you talk about in your book in terms of actually getting specific messages from plants, and not necessarily ayahuasca, but actually you dieted, you know, in a more traditional way with other plants that aren't explicitly psychoactive, which most Westerners who enter these traditions don't ever do. They just stick with the razzle dazzle. And, you know, you were like, no, I'm going to diet with these other guys too, and work with a guy who's like working on that. And so you really went deep with that. And you got some messages that helped with your work. And, you know, which is always remarkable. You know, Jeremy Narby was writing about, like, how can we figure out, let's have scientists do this stuff. Maybe they're going to get messages. And you seem to be an example of someone who did. And so could you just tell a little bit about what a little bit about the plant spirit that you were dieting with that gave you a very particular insight for one of your experiments?
Yeah, well, I think that the most obvious and the most spectacular for me, it was the ayahuma from the Amazon. And this is also known as the cannonball tree, and which is an amazing tree. It's got shining, beautiful flowers. But of course, the fruit is the one that gives it the moniker, and because it does look like a kind of cannonball. and I ended up going back to the Amazon, not really wanting to, but by that stage, this was much later, you know, by that stage, I understood that when the plant says, this is what we do, I do. So I thought, okay, we're going back to Peru. I really don't want to go back there, but fine. And so I found myself in the Pucallpa area, and eventually, you know, I had this interview kind of thing with this old man, a Kokama man, and I went and worked with him for several weeks, and I actually started dieting a different plant. It was the Piñón Blanco. And of course, I didn't know anything about these plants in advance, because I just go and I just allow the elder, the curandero, to, you know, he can evaluate and decide what he thinks I need. So I totally surrender to their knowledge and their ability to evaluate, which might be not a good thing, but I do. And so he started me on the Piñón Blanco, and within 2 days, I had this very clear dream of this plant, and the plant spirit presented itself in my dream as a doctor, and he was carrying this strange thing in his hand, which during my dream I couldn't work out what it was. So in the morning I just described it to my curandero, and he was like, oh, I know exactly what it is. Oh, this is what the plant is saying, that you're going to be dieting. This is the plant that you've come to diet for. And so I'm like, okay, whatever that means. And so, you know, then I ended up obviously starting the dieta with the ayahuma, and ayahuma was a very interesting spirit, because it was very kind of playful for me. It felt very playful. And he had so much to say, so much so that it wasn't I was finding myself writing in my diary, and I only keep diaries when I travel. And so I was finding myself writing, but as if someone was dictating. And so I was just writing down, watching what was coming onto the page. And at one point, I even started drawing these sketches, which were not like just, here's a leaf, or no, they were like pipes and dimensions. And, so it was very clear that what I was drawing was some kind of setup that I needed to build for an experiment. And the funny thing, that's why I say the Ayahuasca for me was playful, because the funny thing is that experiment, which will become famous as the Pavlovian the Pavlovian experiment, that experiment, I was trying to do it using my own mind, the year before. And I was going to use sunflowers. And I had the perfect setup, as I described as well in the book. I had the perfect setup. We built this, contraption, and I thought, this is good. It's going to work. And there was actually no reason why it shouldn't have worked, but it didn't. And so then fast forward a few months later, I'm finding myself in the jungle, in the middle of who knows where, with this plant. And the plant is almost like giggling and saying, like, and by the way, not sunflowers, peas. And I'm like, what? So, of course, I came back home, I booked up the space, and I started building what I was given. And, of course, the plants to be used was the peas. And it was amazing, because the work with Ayahuasca was incredible while I was in the jungle, but also all the way through. It's almost like the plants was there, present, supervising, even when I was in the lab. And it gave me a very, really real, good sense of when we say, I worked with this plant, and people often, especially with ayahuasca and others, but there is a tendency of like, I go back for more, which is fine, but also understanding that, at least for me, my understanding is being like, I am the plant. Like the plant is being incorporated in the sense that I ingested it. I ingested the body, and now that is in here. And so when I go in the lab, now I kind of find like I have a lot of research assistants with me because at different time, different plants will kind of emerge, and I know how they feel. So I know who it is. And so the Ayahuasca was in my lab while I was doing the experiments within me. And it was interesting because, she's known as the plant of the mind. And so, of course, it would work on my mind, but also would work on the experiment that would be kind of quintessential to bring the question of the mind in the context of plants. And it's just, I find it hilarious how good these links, and you don't even see them until, even now I'm realizing this right now as I'm speaking to you. It's like, oh my God. The plant, the quintessential plant for the mind, is using my mind to show the minds of plants.
that is a wonderful, wonderful loop. But I want to ask you something. I've been very interested in these kinds of experiences for a long time, both in my own life, but other people's lives, and trying to understand how people interpret them, particularly when they're not just living in a mystical world all the time, but they're working with reason, with science, or with skepticism, or what does it mean to be, questioning thought. And both in when you speak and in the book, you're very confident about the messages that you get. It's like it's no problem for you. And in my experience, most people aren't really like that. Most people are either more skeptical, even if they get a message, they're like, I don't know, was I making it up? I'm not sure, if you ask them. Or they're very sure, but they're kind of, I don't want to say deluded, but they're kind of like, they're telling themselves a story. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that those are the only categories, because I do believe that some people are very good at getting messages, just the way some people have a remarkable dream life. Some people have the capacity to to anticipate things. I believe that those things can occur. But what I'm interested with you is whether you were always like that. Like if you go back when you were a kid, you were kind of like getting that you always had this kind of dream side or sort of side of you that wasn't limited by reason or wasn't limited by skepticism, even though you obviously can play that game as a scientist? Was it always part of you? Was it something you had to kind of learn through your work with the plants? Or was it just kind of obvious to you and you didn't really have to worry about it?
Well, again, in hindsight, it's easy to see, but while you're in the midst of that, it's not always so graceful and so confident. But, if I think about it now, and you're right, because of this phase of unemployment, and I had a lot of time to really consider who I am, you're right. I feel there is a level of, there is a core inside me that is not going to be moved, or it's going to be moved, but not by the things that don't matter. So now I'm able, because I can see myself from this space, I'm able to see that I was always that, And so, yes, I was always the child that would, rescue the pigeon out of the road because he got driven over by the car, and, nurse the pigeon until it was all right, and then you release it, or, those kind of things. I was born in Italy, which is the quintessential, Catholic country. And so if you want a place where you get brainwashed, that's one of those. And I was really interested. I used to go to church and I was really interested, but I was interested in asking questions. And I got really annoyed when, and this is like when I was a child, and I was really annoyed when the priest or whoever didn't have the answers. And they were telling me, like, you should just have faith. And it's like, yeah, but if I don't understand what faith is, how can I have faith? And so I think that my essence has always been the one of, exploring. What I saw was an obvious enchantment. And so it's like, wow, like, how can you not want to explore this and just trying to play with it? And so I guess science came about to me as exactly that, as a channel to be able to explore disenchantment. And then, of course, because this is a space of duality, and the polarity of enchantment is disenchantment. So I needed to become, at some level, disenchanted. And I did that through my training with science, obviously, where I ended up not feeling anything anymore. So I was the child that was rescuing the pigeon from the street because he got run over. And then you fast forward 20 years later, and I'm in a scientific lab ripping apart the body of a fish so that I can get my data. So, I needed to feel so deeply and then feel nothing, to be able to know what it means to be both. So to be able to know, okay, these are the two polarities that make this reality. And yet I'm none of the two. I can choose to be one of the two, but then I would always know that I'm missing the other. Or I can just sit in the middle and knowing that I can see both, but I don't have to be both either. And this is, I think, the place where I'm at. So that's why I can see my character as the scientist, but I can also bring the more compassionate approach to science, which comes from the other side. And so now I'm in a place where I think I can comfortably do science without compromising science as the scientific method that acquire knowledge. So it's not that I need to be, fluffy, hippie, new agey to do my science, because that wouldn't work, because that's not how science works. So when I do my science, I apply the proper methodology that is the rule of the game. But the way in which I ask the questions in my science might be coming from a different side of the story. And if the questions are formulated correctly, then we can actually find answers that can speak to both sides. And that, I think, one of the major teachings for me from my work with the plants over the decade is it's been very clear. It's like, unless we ground here the teachings from over there, we are having a nice entertainment time, and there's nothing wrong with that. But know that that's what you're doing. for me, for my character, it was very clear that, and the plants would not let me get away with it. So, things would fall apart and break apart if I didn't. So it was part of my training, I guess. Like for me, it's an essential part of like anchoring this kind of otherworldly, if we want to call it, knowledge into this world, so that the two polarities are no longer polarities that are separate, but they can be merged and even transcended. And I guess the attempt with the book is exactly that, to show that a scientist can be a highly mystical person. And it's not that the scientist has gone crazy. It's just that maybe the scientist was never just the scientist.
At the end of the book, you've told some remarkable stories about experiences with ritual, with the conversations with plants, and sort of having this engagement. And I got to say, from my situation, I know those experiences are real. I've had my own versions of them, but they don't necessarily speak to me that directly. Like, I'm like, where did this ritual come from? Why are you doing this thing from West Africa? Da da da. But at the end of the book, you have your final big chapter is about an experience that you had at Muir Woods, which I partly like because I live near the Muir Woods and I love those trees and I can imagine it. And you were at Pioneer, so it's like this is my world or part of my world. But it's a really remarkable experience that I think will resonate with listeners who haven't worked as much with plants, but are very interested in this idea of a glitch in perception, which is a phrase you even use. So I'm just wondering if you could just tell that story or what it was that happened to you and how that portal opened up some deep insights for you.
Well, yeah, that story still lingers because, of course, there is a part of me that can totally explain it, and there is another part that's like, what? But basically, there was a few years ago, it was the first time I came to Pioneers, actually, and I had such an amazing time, and, I was so full. And it was towards the end of my trip. I only had a few more days left before coming back to Australia. And I thought, I really want to just go to the forest and just walk around. And kind of, it was my giving thanks ritual of like, Mary, I received so much. I'm so grateful. And I just want to do this. So I went to Muir Woods. And of course, the first thing I did is I arrived and there was like these bus loads of people. And I was like, oh no, I was imagining that I would be in the forest on my own. And instead it's like there's all these people taking pictures, and which of course is right at the entrance of the park. As soon as you walk a little bit further, everyone disappears. So it's like, oh, excellent. So basically I was walking along the track. I was on my own, and at one point I arrived at this intersection, and just before that I decided to take my shoes off because I really wanted to feel the ground under my feet. And especially in summer here in Australia, I often walk without shoes. So it's nothing really special that I did in that moment, but it was important for what happened because basically I found myself walking along this path. I crossed over the creek on this little bridge thing. And I was in this path. It was one of those that is kind of like the size of one person at the time. So, if someone comes from the opposite direction, you kind of have to put yourself sideways and then let them pass. And so it was very clear that I was walking in one particular direction. And at one point along the path, there was a little puddle of water. And because I was barefoot, I remember stepping my feet in the water and kind of like, like a child splashing a bit. And I thought, oh, cool. There is also water here. And I was just, I was just walking. I found this beautiful tree amongst the many beautiful trees there. And I sat underneath it. And I just did a little bit of my little giving thanks ceremony. I had a little ocarina and I played it. And it was very... The experience itself during that moment was very magical, and it's detailed more in the book. But basically, when I finished that, and I felt okay, now I'm ready to go back. I looked along to this little track that I was walking on, that I had been walking on, and I just curiosity kills the cat, and like I don't know if my cat got killed, but something definitely happened because I was there was a choice to be made, basically. It's like either you carry on walking along the path and you go further along that path, or you turn around and you go down the path where you came from. And so I chose to follow the path a little bit further because the path kind of disappeared under the hill, behind the hill. And I just wanted to see, I just walk up that hill, see what's behind it, and then I'll come back. So that's what I was doing. I was walking forward to along the same direction that I had been walking when I arrived. And I have no idea still how, but I found myself with my feet in the puddle of water again. And I was a little disoriented because I knew that I never turned around and walked down the path. I was walking up the hill. So how is it possible that now I'm in the water and my feet are in the same puddle of water that I saw coming upwards, and I'm facing the wrong direction? I'm facing the exit. And so there was that moment of like, what's going on here? But I didn't really register. It's almost like my body knew that I had been somewhere else for a while and came through back out of the door again. And so I don't know how to explain, and definitely as a scientist, I have no idea. But the experience for me was kind of clear that I had been through a portal of some sort, and the water was the vehicle that made the interface between these two realities, maybe.
Well, one of the things about that story I really like is that it reminds me of a quality that's often the case with some of the more persistent and interesting anomalies, is that they're not necessarily, these huge, spectacular, bizarre. In fact, the more bizarre they are, or at least the more like overwhelmingly extreme they are, and you're like, okay, maybe, sure, I don't know. But the ones that have always affected me when I read them or talk to them or to other people, and in my own case, once or twice, there's something kind of a little humble, or just sort of, they're right over here, but the more you think about them, you realize that you can't help but there's nowhere to put them. And then they force you to keep going. And what I love about the story in the book is that it also opens up, it launches you into some of my favorite passages in this book. Sometimes your book is very poetic and mystical. Sometimes it's very concrete and scientific. But the thoughts that you have here, I found, particularly remarkable. At least they stuck with me. And I want to read a few lines that you write about, because you kind of talk about space and time, and there's this really interesting reflection on time that gets us back around to this question of nature. So we don't have a few minutes left, but we can squeeze it in. What the redwood forest and the Muir Woods had revealed was that the Earth's embrace grounds us all within this shared timescape, and it is precisely through this grounding that the gates to other dimensions of reality open. In other words, the awareness of this coherent background, the background of nature, marks a steady reference position, the true point of departure to realize our capacity to move in and around the reference itself, time. And it is against this coherent backdrop that we can be alerted of the serendipitous occurrence of flawless incongruities, which is a wonderful phrase, perfect glitches whose arrival allows for other dimensional potentialities to be perceived at all. It seems paradoxically that our departure from and arrival to are exactly the same place. And as it had been the case for me with my puddle of muddy water in the forest, we may only understand our departure once we realize our arrival. To me, that's just like top-notch mystical weirdness, but what I will like about it in the context of our conversation now is it helps answer this very interesting question, which is, what do we say about nature, about the nature that is revealed to us through science, not so much our mystical experiences or indigenous interactions, but the science that gives us a Darwinian picture of evolution where things emerged over eons of time. And in a way, and often in your book, you kind of speak as a Darwinist. You do recognize that there are these selection pressures, that kind of language, which is so often anti-enchantment, is one that you embrace. But you embrace it in relationship to this multidimensionality. And that, to me, is a real, very important place for us to articulate now. So we don't collapse one into the other. It's not like we're saying that science is actually mysticism. It's that the mystical view is a broader domain. So I guess I just want to hear you talk a little bit more. We only have a couple minutes, but about how you see, the nature that that science recognizes, the nature that is articulated through a Darwinian perspective, through a materialist way of talking about it from that multidimensional side.
I think it's for me it's pretty simple. They're like, just as we're talking about multiple perspective and multidimensional spaces, well, the Darwinian is just one of many. And there is no one better than or exclusion of. It's like they are not in conflict. They're just coexisting. And so there are parts and aspects of each one of those that can be useful in the sense that by approaching, we reveal who we are. And then we can also let it go because we are not that. We know that we are all of the others as well. And so I don't have a conflict. And that's, I think, maybe is the main point of my book. It's like there is no conflict between science and what we call mysticism, spirituality, or whatever we want to call it. It's like, but at the same time, yes, science is not mysticism, but it is. So it's just that it's an exercise of removing these dogmatic and dualistic view of the world. The world is not dual; it's multiple, and at the same time, because of that, it's nothing. And it was actually a plant that only a few months ago, just before I came back to Bioneers this year, that brought me all the way to Mexico, and it brought me into a dark room, and I spent a long time in this dark room on my own, with nothing else to do except being there. And I saw the amazing world of ideas that we can use to play in this space. So and I express this through my science, but it's not very different from what a musician does or a painter does. And I'm all of those too. So, and at the same time, I also saw the absolute ridiculously empty nothingness that we are. And so I'm still all of it. And in that sense, how to translate that into this reality, which is the one that we are kind of keeping fixed by reference points, as you mentioned from reading the book. That's all. We're just considering some reference points more important than others, but just, they're arbitrary, all of them.
Yeah.
So I don't see the conflict.
Great. Well, I think that's actually part of what makes you a wonderful exemplar, and also probably annoys some of your critics, is that you're not conflicted. You're not like, oh, well, I feel this thing, and which is wonderful. But we're going to have to end it with this note. It was a wonderful conversation. Monica Gagliano, Thus Spoke the Plant. Please check it out. It's a great book, and good luck on your future endeavors. I'm glad your career worked out.
Thank you so much, Erik, and thank you for having me.
Sure. Okay, folks, till next week. Keep your minds open.